You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 365, State of the Union, 1790. Over the past few episodes, we covered Congress's first session, which was supposed to begin in March 1789, but really didn't start until April because they had trouble getting a quorum. This first session of Congress lasted until the end of September. Now, during that session, Congress did a great deal, much of which we covered over the last few episodes. This included establishing the three executive departments, State, War, and Treasury, as well as the Office of Attorney General. It also established the entire federal judiciary. The president made appointments to all of those new offices, and the Senate confirmed them. The president made other appointments, such as new tax collectors and other things, so basically appointing the entire federal government. Congress also spent considerable time debating and sending the Bill of Rights to the states for ratification. Now, there were plenty of other topics debated and dealt with during the first session. These included establishing officers to manage the Northwest Territory. Arthur Sinclair would serve as the first territorial governor. This was just a confirmation of a decision that had already been made by the Confederation Congress. Many of the issues in the first session saw some progress, but were still pending when the second session returned in January of 1790. One particularly contentious issue was tariffs. The big reason behind replacing the Articles with the Constitution was to make it easier for Congress to raise revenue to pay off its war debt, and tariffs were the way this was going to happen. James Madison proposed a tariff plan when the first Congress began, way back in April of 1789. Madison believed that raising revenue should be the primary purpose of any tariffs. Others, however, disagreed. On the day after Madison proposed his tariff plan, Congress Thomas Fitzsimmons of Pennsylvania moved to add a list of specific imports that should be subjected to tariffs. Now, Fitzsimmons' goal was not to raise revenue, it was to protect the budding manufacturing industry in Pennsylvania from foreign competition. Members of the New England delegation quickly jumped on this idea. The New England manufacturing industry, still in its infancy, had trouble competing with foreign imports, primarily from Britain. Heavy tariffs on imports of items that could be made domestically would help these local industries to grow and thrive. Now, Southerners largely opposed these protectionist policies. The primarily agricultural South did not want to have to pay more for goods that they imported, just so Northern manufacturers would have an unfair advantage in selling their goods under this protectionist system. At the same time, some Southerners sought high tariffs on certain agricultural products that would benefit the Southern states. There were also debates on whether to punish certain countries for their trade policies. For example, Madison proposed an extra high tariff on Britain, which is where most American imports came from, because Britain's ports were closed to American exports. As the debate got more heated, George Thatcher of the Massachusetts Maine District proposed a 50% import tariff on each head of slaves imported. This inflamed Southern delegates, who were outraged. Although Thatcher didn't seriously think such a duty could pass, another delegate, Josiah Parker of Virginia, seriously proposed a $10 per head duty on slave imports. Now, Parker, even though he's from Virginia, opposed slavery on moral grounds. But Virginia also had a glut of slaves at the moment, so more imports would reduce the value of those existing slaves, disadvantaging many white slave owners in Virginia. So while some Virginians liked the idea of imposing an import duty on slaves, states like South Carolina and Georgia, who were still heavily reliant on importing more slaves, objected in the strongest terms. Now, members felt pressure to act quickly despite the contention, since each day without a tariff law was another day of missed revenue. The busy spring and summer season of imports in 1789 went by with no federal taxes collected. Members worked to reach a reasonable compromise. In the end, a wide range of imports were subject to specific duties of about 7% to 8%. A reduced molasses tax ensured that continued molasses imports would allow New Englanders to make their rum. A distilled spirits tax was also imposed. American-owned ships would also pay a tonnage duty of 6 cents per ton. Foreign vessels would pay 50 cents per ton. Eager to get something in place, the House and Senate passed this compromise bill in January of 1789 and sent it to the president for his signature. Washington signed the bill, but disagreement over its terms meant that this would be a continuing issue in Congress during the next term. Congress also ordered Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton to prepare a report on national debts so that Congress could decide how aggressive its revenue collection had to be. Other issues, heavily debated but not resolved in this first session, included the decision of where to move the national capital. Madison and others tried to keep it off the agenda because it was such a divisive issue, but members still wanted to get it resolved. Many of the congressional responsibilities that were listed in the Constitution but never got addressed in the first session. There was just so much to do, and there wasn't enough time. When Congress returned for its second session in January 1790, President Washington decided it was time to report to Congress on the State of the Union. Now, the Constitution didn't say anything other than that the president should report to Congress from time to time on the State of the Union. It didn't say when or how often it should happen. It didn't even require that the report be given in person. Washington's decision to give his address in person, and at this particular time, may have come from the tradition in Britain when the king gave an address to the opening of Parliament. It helped set the legislative agenda by listing priorities and concerns for the members. Washington was not a big fan of public speaking and certainly didn't want to do anything that might imitate the King of England. But after conferring with Madison and others, he determined to give the address in person, and Madison also assisted in drafting his address. Washington wrote to Congress asking to schedule an appearance. Congress was supposed to return on January 4th, but a quorum didn't show up until January 7th. At that point, a joint committee from the House and Senate agreed to invite the president to address Congress the following day at noon in the Senate chamber. There was a scramble to prepare for the president, including considerable debate over whether members of Congress should sit or stand for the address. The decision was to sit, so chairs for all the House members and senators had to be carried into the chamber, while tables were removed to make enough room. Washington started several traditions in his first State of the Union address that were not contemplated by the Constitution. As I said, appearing in person was a big one. Another was that he brought the Chief Justices and several members of his cabinet to the Capitol to hear his address. This changed the tone from the president simply reporting to Congress to one of all three branches coming together to hear the speech. The president arrived shortly before the scheduled time, wearing a dark suit from Hartford that he had purchased during his recent New England tour. He was still wearing a black armband to mourn the death of his mother, who had died that previous August. The address itself was relatively short. Washington noted with satisfaction that North Carolina had joined the Union. One of the first things after that was his focus on the need to establish a real military. As he put it in his speech, quote, "To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving the peace." Washington went on to note that a free people should be both armed and disciplined. He also called for more efforts to promote local manufacturing, particularly in the area of military supplies. The president's primary concern at this time was hostile Indians. He continued to have his State Department work on treaties, but the danger of war was always present. He also called for better pay for U.S. diplomats abroad. Congress would eventually address the issue of diplomatic pay about 6 months later. Aside from defense, there were other matters which the Constitution explicitly required Congress to handle, but were still outstanding. One was establishing uniform currency and weights and measures. Another outstanding task was establishing naturalization laws so that foreigners could become citizens. Washington encouraged Congress to address both of these issues. Washington also emphasized his concern for supporting local industry and for building more infrastructure in the forms of roads and post offices. He called for the promotion of science and literature, and he went on to note that every valuable end of government is best answered by the enlightened confidence of the people and by teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights, to discern and provide against invasions of them, to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority, between burdens proceeding from a disregard to their convenience and those resulting from the inevitable exigencies of society, to discriminate the spirit of liberty from that of licentiousness, cherishing the first, avoiding the last. He also called for more aid to schools and the institution of a national university. In a nod to the House of Representatives, the president noted that they had called for a report on public credit and the need to provide support for it. Washington agreed with this view and promised to cooperate in any way that he could. Secretary of Treasury Hamilton would deliver the administration's report on public credit the following day. The president concluded by noting that he had delivered to Congress a great many documents to give them the details on the State of the Union. He ended by saying, quote, "The welfare of our country is the great object to which our cares and efforts ought to be directed, and I shall derive great satisfaction from a cooperation with you in the pleasing though arduous task of ensuring to our fellow citizens the blessings which they have a right to expect from a free, efficient, and equal government." Following the president's address and his departure, the House considered the speech in a committee of the whole. They appointed a smaller committee to write a formal reply. That committee included Madison, who of course had a role in writing the president's address in the first place. The committee completed the document 4 days after the address and delivered it in person to the president at his residence on January 14th. The House response said that they pretty much agreed with everything the president said, sharing congratulations over the admission of North Carolina. They promised to continue the people's work and concluded by saying, quote, "The prosperity of the United States is the primary object of all our deliberations, and we cherish the reflection that every measure which we may adopt for its advancement will not only receive your cheerful concurrence, but will at the same time derive from your cooperation additional efficacy in ensuring to our fellow citizens the blessings of a free, efficient, and equal government." The Senate wrote a similar response, essentially agreeing with each point the president had made. It completed its response 1 day sooner than the House, but also waited until January 14th to deliver it to the president in person. Vice President John Adams led the delegation to deliver the Senate's reply. The Senate ended its response with, quote, "Our cares and efforts shall be directed to the welfare of our country, and we have the most perfect dependence on your cooperating with us on all occasions in such measures as will ensure to our fellow citizens the blessings which they have a right to expect from a free, efficient, and equal government." Washington's address did seem to set the tone for the next congressional session, and many of the issues he raised in his speech were addressed by Congress. The Army, which consisted of only a few hundred officers and men, was being used primarily in the Northwest Territory to protect new settlers from Indian attacks. Congress had already authorized an army of 840 officers and men, but there were only 672 actually serving. At Washington's urging, in June, Congress increased the size of the Army to 1,273 officers and men, adding 4 additional infantry companies under a 3-year enlistment. However, due to low pay and poor conditions, the Army had trouble enlisting new recruits. By early 1791, the Army still totaled only just over 800 officers and men. Without a large professional military, Washington knew that militia would be critical to any military emergency. Several weeks after his address, the president met with Secretary of War Henry Knox to work on establishing uniform guidelines for militia. Although the president brought this issue to Congress again by the end of the year, Congress would not pass a Militia Act until 1792. When they finally did, it authorized the president to call out the militia in time of invasion or danger of invasion. Congress finally acted after a disastrous Indian battle at Wabash, something that we will probably cover in a future episode. On the currency issue, Congress ended up passing this back to the executive branch. It called on the Secretary of State to come up with a plan for establishing uniformity in currency and weights and measures. It also called on the Secretary of Treasury to come up with a plan for establishing a mint. Secretary of State Jefferson, who didn't even arrive in New York to take his new position until March of 1790, had earlier proposed a decimal system of currency back in 1785, which is probably why Congress gave this to him rather than to Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury. Jefferson also wanted a system of measurements that were based on decimals, basically a forerunner of the metric system. But Jefferson not only arrived late to his office, he suffered migraines after his arrival in New York, which greatly limited his ability to work. After Jefferson submitted his report to Congress in July, Congress was not really sure what to do with it, and it ended up tabling all of his proposals until the end of the year. Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton took even longer. He spent much of the year researching the British model of currency, focusing on metal alloys to be used in coins. Hamilton spent months considering the various denominations, as well as new designs for all of the American coins. He agreed with Jefferson that it made sense to use a decimal system in currency. In fact, Jefferson and Hamilton worked really closely on this project and found themselves in agreement on many of the issues. Jefferson gave input based on his visits to the French Mint while he was serving as American minister in France. In the end, mostly because Hamilton was so busy with other matters, Jefferson ended up taking over much of the responsibility for establishing the Mint, which didn't get final approval in Congress until 1791. With regard to rules on naturalization, Congress decided to handle this one itself. A week after the president's address, the House of Representatives formed a committee to come up with rules of naturalization. It took the committee about 6 weeks to come up with a final bill, which the House passed on March 4th. The Senate took a couple of weeks to consider and amend the House bill, and final reconciliation was done in about a week. Washington signed the bill into law. The final bill permitted citizenship to free white people of good character who had lived in the United States for a minimum of 2 years. They had to take an oath of allegiance to support the Constitution. Any children under the age of 21 who were also living in the U.S. became citizens automatically when their father did. They also determined that any child born abroad to U.S. citizens would be considered a natural-born U.S. citizen. Application and approval for naturalization could take place in any court within the United States. State and local courts would handle most of this work. Congress's efforts to protect domestic manufacturing and industry had already been done through its protective tariffs that I discussed at the beginning of this episode, but these did remain an ongoing fight in Congress as to the details. In April, Congress also created the first patent and copyright laws in order to encourage the science and the arts, as the president had requested, and Washington signed this into law on May 31st. People who wanted their books, maps, and charts protected for up to 14 years had to register their copyrighted works with a local district court. They were also permitted to renew their copyright for another 14 years, meaning a total of 28 years for a copyright. Congress also set up a patent board consisting of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General. These men would meet as a group and evaluate any patent application to determine if it was sufficiently useful and important. The board could then issue a patent that would be granted for a period not to exceed 14 years. Congress did not take any action regarding education. Washington's call for a national university would not be realized until 1821, decades after his death. And one other big change for the president shortly after his speech was a new home. Washington had been living in a residence at 3 Cherry Street for nearly a year. In February of 1790, he moved to 39 Broadway, a large 4-story house recently vacated by the French minister. Its larger rooms and grander furnishings were deemed more appropriate for the president to receive visitors and to entertain. President Washington continued his work with Congress through the spring of 1790. Sadly, New York City's health conditions plagued Washington once again. In May, he became quite sick with influenza and pneumonia. Witnesses reported that it impacted both his hearing and his eyesight. Over the next week, it only got worse, with his breathing becoming weaker. The 4 doctors attending to him reported on May 15th that they did not have any hope that the president would recover. This caused panic throughout the Capitol, as government leaders and others feared that the president's death might lead to the end of the federal government. Over the next night, however, the fever suddenly broke and Washington began to recover. In a letter around this time, Washington wrote, quote, "Within the last 12 months, I have undergone more and severer sickness than 30 preceding years afflicted me with." He added that another would, quote, "more than probable put me to sleep with my fathers." By May 20th, the president was past the worst of it. The doctors pronounced that he was on the road to recovery, though it would be several more weeks before he could resume his duties. Next week, the nation begins to expand in the South, and Rhode Island finally joins the Union. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Chasen Harrison and Gordon Kemp. I also want to welcome Timothy Rothwell, who joined as a standard bearer on Patreon last week. I really do appreciate everyone who allows this podcast to continue by helping to support it financially. Now, this week we covered the first State of the Union address. I hesitate to call it that because it was not known as the State of the Union at the time. It was called the President's Annual Address. The Constitution says that the President had a duty to, quote, "from time to time, give Congress information of the State of the Union." The first president to refer to the State of the Union address as such was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. I guess because Washington opted to give the address annually, it became known early on as the President's Annual Address, and Washington would give an address at the beginning of each session of Congress, and John Adams would continue that tradition. In 1801, though, when Jefferson took office, he decided to end the tradition. Instead of calling it the President's Annual Address, he called it the President's Annual Message. He still provided one annually at the beginning of each session of Congress, but he simply had his private secretary deliver a written message, and that written report would be read to each house by their clerks. Jefferson did not like the idea of an in-person address. He thought it was too much like the King's speech at the opening of Parliament. In his view, it was an imitation of aristocracy and inappropriate for a republic. The message mostly served as a collection of reports from various executive departments, giving an update of their activities. This annual message remained a written report until 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson returned to the tradition of giving the message in person. Wilson also used the speech more to set an agenda for the coming year rather than a report on the previous one, much like George Washington had done. After Wilson reintroduced the tradition of an in-person address, the format changed from year to year. Wilson delivered 6 in-person addresses, but his last 2 were written reports. This was after he had suffered a stroke. His successor gave both of his in-person, as did Coolidge in 1923 when he replaced Harding. Coolidge's address in 1923 was the first to go out live over the radio. But after that, Coolidge's next 3 addresses, as well as all 4 of his successor, Herbert Hoover's addresses, were all in writing. Hoover was the last president not to deliver any of his addresses in person. Roosevelt and Truman returned to the in-person address, which has been pretty consistent ever since. Truman's 1947 address was the first to be broadcast on television. Several presidents have opted not to give an address in their final year after an opponent of the other party won the presidency. Truman, Eisenhower, and Carter all skipped their final years. Eisenhower also sent in a film summary of his message from Florida in 1956 after suffering from a heart attack. That recording was broadcast nationwide. Beginning in 1965, Lyndon Johnson moved the time of the address from early afternoon to prime time. He held his address at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. The speech has over time morphed from an address to Congress, really more to an address to the nation, with Congress as an audience. The following year, 1966, the Republican leaders in Congress began offering a televised response. This response was given 5 days after President Johnson's address. The tradition of giving the opposition a response immediately after the president's address began in the 1980s through a combination of live responses or pre-recorded videos, but today it's pretty consistent that the opposition gives a live response immediately following the president's address. These have become pretty established traditions at this point. I also mentioned in the main show the establishment of patent and copyright laws. I wanted to add a bit of trivia to this. The first book that was copyrighted, only a few days after the law went into effect in June, was the Philadelphia Spelling Book by John Barry. This is a different John Barry than the Commodore who led Navy ships during the war, but it is another John Barry from Philadelphia. Patent number 1 was granted at the end of July to Samuel Hopkins, also of Philadelphia, for his process of making potash and pearl ash, which was used for fertilizer and soap. This Samuel Hopkins was no relation to the New England Reverend Samuel Hopkins, who was an early abolitionist. I also mentioned briefly that Washington changed houses in early 1790. The new residence, which was owned by Alexander Macomb, was much larger and grander than the one Washington had previously occupied. Washington purchased the ornate furnishings from the departing French minister. He also added a new technological feature. He bought 14 whale oil lamps to light up the public areas of the house. These lamps burned much brighter than candles and did not leave a smoky residue. Washington also noted that they were much cheaper to burn than candles. He was only there for a few months, though. In August, he went home to Mount Vernon, and when he returned to work at the capital had moved to Philadelphia. The Macomb House became a hotel in the 1820s. It was eventually torn down, although I'm not sure when. Several sites say the building was razed in 1940, but the skyscraper that's on the location was built in 1928. In giving my book recommendation this week, I want to make clear that no single book did a really comprehensive job on the topic this week. I drew from material from quite a few different biographies of George Washington, as well as Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and others. That said, I give you one book recommendation each week, so this week's is Mr. President, George Washington and the Making of the Nation's Highest Office by Harlow Giles Unger. This Washington biography focuses on his presidency. It's a relatively short book at under 250 pages, not counting notes and index, but it covers Washington's presidency well and is a good read. I've already recommended 2 other books by this same author, one on Patrick Henry, another on John Laurens, and I probably would have recommended American Tempest about the Boston Tea Party if I was doing recommendations that far back. The author started out in life as a journalist, but beginning in his 60s, which was in the 1990s, he began churning out lots of books, including a great many from the Revolution and probably a dozen Revolution-era biographies. This is actually one of 3 books that he's written that focus on some aspect of George Washington's life. So if this sounds interesting, get a copy of Mr. President, George Washington and the Making of the Nation's Highest Office by Harlow Giles Unger. My online recommendation is a link to the full text of George Washington's 1790 address. It's not very long. It's only about 1,000 words. It should only take about 6 or 7 minutes if you want to read it. I know this because I plan to read it myself out loud later this week. I'm going to be releasing a bonus recording this week, which will be my reading of George Washington's first annual address in 1790. So look forward to seeing that next week. My question this week asks, how do you define the terms Tory and Patriot? Well, I defined these terms pretty early in the podcast, but I guess it's worth covering again. The term Tory came from Britain. The term originally was a pejorative that referred to Irish Catholic outlaws. It later morphed into use to describe the supporters of King James I and his Catholic descendants who were removed from the throne. Later it became used to distinguish people who supported the king having more political power, as opposed to the Whigs who wanted more power to remain with Parliament. During the Revolutionary War, it referred to colonists who supported the king and who opposed independence. Of course, today the Tory is the name of a conservative political party in Britain. Again, that's morphing even further from the definition it had in the 18th century. The term patriot also came from Britain, and originally meant someone who would fight for the legitimate king, even when that king had been displaced. During the English Civil War, the, quote, patriot Whigs opposed the king's ministry and supported Parliament and English liberties over the perceived corruption of the king. The term patriot was often used as a pejorative by royalists. During the Revolutionary War, the colonists, who saw themselves as the Whig defenders of English liberties, referred to themselves as patriots. The patriots supported the rights of colonists and later those who supported independence. I've received some criticism for use of the term patriot to describe the pro-independence faction, arguing that it shows my pro-independence bias. In fact, I use the term because that was the term used at the time by the colonists themselves. I've also tended to use the term loyalist rather than Tory when describing the other side. I think both loyalist and Tory are interchangeable to describe the pro-king faction of the colonists, but I tend to use the term loyalist just for consistency and because I think it's better understood by an American audience. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.